hope you take a few minutes and listen up as I cover some of the material for 11th grade U.S. history. This is a lot of material that we're going to cover. Now, so far we've covered through the 26 chapters, and in this segment we're going to be looking specifically at chapter 27, and then with a little less emphasis on the remainder of the textbook. I want to first of all remind you that you should read all of the material. You're not going to be responsible to do questions on all of the material, but I do want you to read it all. Much of the material in the later chapters deal with, I always think of it kind of like as a newsreel, where it just gives you highlights of events that take place during the presidential administration. So I want you to take time and read it. It doesn't go in a lot of detail. It mentions names and dates are important. I think one important thing is to learn a little bit about the chronology of how things develop. You'll notice that much of the material here in the time period after World War II, the events are very much determine what our country is involved in today. So these are very important things, but it's almost as if the authors of the book have just added a new section at a time, like you might see with an annual to an encyclopedia. So I want you to approach it and look at it from that perspective. Let me give you some instructions. Chapter 27 is World War II. I don't know how much you know about World War II. There's lots of videos you can watch if you're interested in it and find the details. But I do want you to read all of chapter 27. And there's a lot of material here that deal with the war itself. The events that led to America entering the war, the problems that developed before as a result of the end of World War II and the Peace of Paris and those things that took place. The Treaty of Versailles kind of set the stage for World War II. And I might, remind you that at the time people thought World War I was the war to end all wars, but remember it didn't. And no one would have thought there would be a war quite like World War II that took place. The devastation and destruction, and so many nations involved in this crisis. Whether there'll be a World War III or not, I don't know. But I do know that there are continuing wars, and you'll see those. We have, after World War II, we have the Korean War, we have the Vietnam War, we have conflict in the Middle East, we have numbers of revolutions that take place in Africa during the time period of the Cold War. So, for many ways, we have not ended the war, not to mention problems that develop in the Middle East with Iraq and the Iraqi War, and of course Desert Storm, and all the aspects of that you might be more familiar with. These things are mentioned in the text, but not as much detail as there is in World War II. So in chapter 27 deals with World War II. I want you to obviously read all of it, and I do want you to do all the section reviews in chapter 27, okay? And that's a pretty lengthy chapter. But I think there's a lot of information here for you, and that's why I want you to do those section reviews, okay? There are 6 of them, and most of them have about 10 questions, some a few less, but in that chapter, so there's a lot of work to do on that one. In the rest of the material, I want you to do, to read them, of course, but I'm not requiring you to do the terms. And again, it's a lot of reading. I would suggest you break it down. Don't try to read it all at once. Divide it up, think about it. There is kind of an outline to not just chapter 28, but on through the book. And you'll notice on number 3, on the sheet that I gave you, and this is to be done in writing, and I'm going to collect it, turn it in on the due date of May 15th, and it will be graded. Now notice what I say for number 3. Write a summary of each of the presidential administrations, including the major domestic and foreign affairs of each. Now, if you'll notice, to begin with, on page 479, you'll see the first one. Now, the chapter title is Years of Strength and Stability, but you'll notice the major emphasis here. It says the Truman years, and that's what I'm referring to, the administration. of President Truman. What events took place? What are the key things? All I want you to do is briefly summarize the events that take place. You'll notice that there's a larger number of things about the Truman administration. So they're all not going to be the same, and I'm not going to say, 100 words or 150 words. You cover the material. Look at it and write a summary. It doesn't mean that you have to put everything in it, but make sure you have a general understanding of what's taking place at home and what's taking place in our relationships with other countries. So I think it is an important part of your study. You'll notice as you go through your text, describes home life during the time period. And if you go through in your reading, you'll notice that we'll have the administrations of Eisenhower, who followed Truman, and then of course President Kennedy. Now again, was not president for very long, but there were a number of key events that took place. And then of course the administrations of Johnson. I didn't put him down on here. Make sure that you do him as well. I should have. Remember, he finished the term for when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and then he won the next election as well. And of course, it's during this time that we see the Vietnam War. So rather than discuss the wars as such, I'm asking you to look at it from the perspective of the presidents. Okay, so include with Kennedy, include Johnson, even though he's not on the sheet. Don't forget Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and G.W. Bush. Okay, the text ends with a brief introduction of the election of 2008, in which Barack Obama won, but it doesn't go into the events of his election. So you're going to have a number of summaries there. Each one should be marked with the name of the president to whom it represents in his administration. But make sure that will convince me that you've taken time to read the material here. Okay, so I'm not looking for big, long reports on each one, but a summary of each one of the presidents and the events that are given in the time frame. And then to finish up for the year, I've included with you the exam. And take time, become familiar again with your textbook. The exam covers all 31 chapters, and it will be graded. You can use your book. You should use your book. Remember, you have a glossary if there's terms. You also have an index for locating the places in your book where you can find the names of individuals. And the reason that I'm mentioning that to you is in these last chapters, there's going to be a number of individuals mentioned that we haven't had time to discuss. So make sure that you use what's available to you in your textbook. Do the very best you can on the exam. You notice on the very bottom of the page, I put, make sure this is your own work. Some have been copying wrong answers. And it's kind of foolish, isn't it? When you want to take a shortcut and you want to borrow someone else's work, and then you end up making the same mistakes they do. It's kind of telling, isn't it? But I'll be looking over this, and I will be grading all of this material. Okay, so we're trying to finish up the year. We are going to go through the textbook. Your responsibility is to read it. The only section review questions you have to do are from chapter 27. But then you are to do the summary reports from the rest of the material through the textbook, as well as complete the exam. Hopefully you'll do well. Your grades should be fine. You've done really well all year. And just buckle down and work hard. Again, don't leave it go to the last minute, because those summaries are going to take a little bit of time. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you again.